very pleased to start this presentation from Matt Barr from the University of Glasgow. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for that welcome. I'm slightly nervous that you've bigged up my presentation, but I'll do my best. So yes, my name's Matt. I'm based at the University of Glasgow, as Margaret says, and I'm going to give a little talk about some of the potentially positive effects of playing video games based on some research we've done here at Glasgow. So Margaret asked me to just introduce myself. That's me, probably circa 1990 or so, I think. But anyway, let's cover that up quickly. So yes, I'm Matt, and I'm head of the Education and Practice section in the School of Computing Science at Glasgow, where I also run the graduate apprenticeship in software engineering. The Education and Practice section is somewhat new. It's an amalgam of the computing science education side and our software engineering side as well. And it sits alongside the more traditional sections that you would expect, like HCI and systems and data. So that we formed that just over a year ago, actually, when we brought the two sides together. But beyond that, I do a couple of other things. I run the Ada Scotland Festival, for example, which is about getting more girls into computing science. And off the back of that, and I think I saw Safia on the call, we will be hosting the BCS Lovelace Colloquium in Glasgow next year. So very much looking forward to that. So while I also research things like computing science education, EDI, and inclusion, a lot of my older research or previous research has been on video games. In the past, I was the BAFTA Scotland Games jury chair, which was a nice gig. And I was previously one of the directors of the Scottish Game Developers Association, which originated as the Scottish chapter of the IGDA, if you're familiar with them. I've even dabbled in a little bit of game design and games narrative teaching at another university, but right now I'm co-director at the Glasgow University Games and Gaming Lab. So lots of game stuff, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So a little bit of preamble. As we all know on this call, video games are a big part of many people's lives. And looking at the most recent stats for the UK, nearly everyone, or about, well, 86% of people aged 16 to 69, I think it is, have played computer games or mobile games in the last year based on the UK statistics, UK being one of the trade bodies that represents the industry. And something I like to point out usually at this stage is that about 50% of those players are female and nearly half are over the age of 40. Some people don't realize that that's the case. There's still that stereotypical view of games as a pastime. There was a time when I used to more or less track the average age. I seem to have overtaken the average age a little bit now, but it remains very much a pastime enjoyed by many people from many backgrounds. So with that in mind, with the sort of ubiquity, I guess, of games in mind, it's important that we understand the positives and negatives associated maybe with playing them. Problem is that our understanding, or the popular understanding of the issues, is kind of muddied by a mixture of bad science and rumors and some bad reporting, I have to say, as well. In fact, for as long as there have been video games, so let's say from the 1970s in terms of certainly home video games, people have been talking about how they're bad for us. But most of the research, or a lot of the research into games, was focused on the bad effects that games are supposed to have on us. You could kind of characterize a lot of the research through the 80s and 90s as being focused on these alleged bad effects. And those effects were associated with things like concerns about cardiovascular health, about games causing seizures, about physical injuries that were called Nintenditis, which I think we hopefully understand is not ballooned into an epidemic. So from the beginning, psychological effects of games have been the subject of some debate, right? Including the threat of addiction, or what's sometimes called pathological preoccupation, or maybe causing violent behavior, even hallucinations. And the reason that video games have an age rating on them is partly because in the early 90s, at the height of the kind of hysteria, concerns about video games were raised in places like the UK Parliament, but in particular in parts of the US government. And that's what led us to having video game ratings. Um, so that all seems a bit distant, the US government and so on. But of course, the games industry is a global industry. It is increasingly US centric in terms of where the businesses operate out of. But two of the best selling video games of all time have significant ties to the UK, specifically Scotland as it happens. But Grand Theft Auto 5 was developed primarily by Rockstar North, based in Edinburgh. I say primarily because those games, and this would extend to Red Dead Redemption 2, are too big to be produced by a single studio now. So while Rockstar North takes the lead on something like Grand Theft Auto 5, and it's not a secret to say Grand Theft Auto 6, Santa Monica and the other various studios around the world will be chipping in as well because of the scale of the operation. The other one to point out is that the console versions of Minecraft, certainly in the last decade, across Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo, were developed by 4J Studios up in Dundee. And so for context, like GTA 5 has sold something like probably 150, 160 million copies, maybe even more by now. And Minecraft has sold something like 250 million copies across all platforms. So while those games are owned by American companies, they are made here in the UK, and they're not alone. Those are the big hitting franchises. I like to point out Observation as a Scottish success story, partly because it's developed here in Glasgow by my pal John. But that was the 2019 or the 2020 BAFTA award for Best British Game was Observation, which, if you haven't played it, is an excellent little, very atmospheric, very narrative-driven sort of puzzler. It'll come as no surprise when you look at the game just to find out that John was one of the lead artists on Alien Isolation, which came out a few years beforehand, before he set up his own studio. But Observation is far from the only British game to be making waves. So some other big hitters at the BAFTA Awards in recent years have been Vampire Survivors, the most recent version of Forza Horizon, Two Point Campus, and many other games. So I don't need to tell you guys here. I mean, this slide is more for preaching to the unconverted, as it were, just to bring home just how big business this is. It's not some hobby. So the latest figures show that in terms of the amount of money spent on games software in the UK, we're looking at something well over £5 billion a year. It's also a big part of the UK economy. So when you look at all the jobs, I mean, it's probably quite hard to get a very exact figure here, but if we look at all the jobs that come from the industry, it's something like 44,000, and it makes its contribution to the public offers, of course, as well. But anyway, I'll skip over that quickly because I don't think I need to tell this particular audience about the size of the games industry. So if we come back to the controversy surrounding video games, I think it's worth pointing out that we've been here before. Virtually every new form of entertainment, whether it's radio, film, TV, comics, of course, or even the humble novel, has been the subject of some initial moral panic. And by moral panic, I mean people worrying, usually unnecessarily, that something new is bad for us. Many people on the call will remember the video nasties panic that followed the introduction of VHS. There was the satanic panic that came up around Dungeons and Dragons before that, and so on and so forth. And the thing is that video games are still relatively new. If we take my sort of 1972-ish as the sort of beginning of the big explosion in home consoles, they're only about 50 years old. So that moral panic persists. And part of the reason why I put this Simpsons picture in was to get rid of this, was just to cover this guy up. So, for example, at the start of his last term, I can't believe I'm saying those words, but at the start of his last term as president of the United States, Donald Trump suggested, without any evidence to support the claim, that a spate of horrible events in the US were the result of gruesome and violent video games, to use his words. Now, of course, games are violent. Many games are violent. Not all are. Some are violent. So something like Grand Theft Auto that I've mentioned already keeps coming up in the news because of that violent content. But the thing is, those games are not for kids. They are rated 18. And there was a quote from an organization called the Association of Teachers and Lecturers that I really liked. And they said something along the lines of the ATL, as they're known, it isn't calling for a ban of games or any kind of censorship at all. What all they want is for parents to become aware of what their kids are seeing when they play those games. So it's much more about awareness of what's in the games. The issue isn't necessarily their mature and yes, potentially controversial content. It's more to do with lack of awareness around the intended audience. Um, I've got GTA on the page here again, of course, but in common with many titles, it's designed for an adult audience, and it's rated 18 by PEGI, the body that's now responsible for video game classification in the UK. But the fact that this keeps coming up, this controversy around games like GTA 5, and we know we will have this again when GTA 6 comes out, it's a lack of, I think, parental understanding about the age classification system. Again, I can remember that kids my age were able to get hold of, I don't know, say Terminator or Evil Dead and so on when they were on VHS. Maybe not Evil Dead, I think it was initially banned, but videos that we shouldn't have been able to see because some parents didn't really know, didn't know about the age rating system or weren't aware that these films were available. Um, Kids in the 80s were able to see them. And actually, if we go back, I don't always talk about this bit, but if we go back a little bit more, it's well over a decade now. There was this very influential report on the impact of video games and internet use in the UK. That was the Safer Children in a Digital World report. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with that. That report was the result of Dr. Tanya Brown's review, which was commissioned by the government. I think it would have been Gordon Brown's government, I think, at that point, commissioned a review of children's video games and internet use. And it made a number of recommendations, mostly around age classification and about parent and carer responsibilities. And sensibly enough, Tanya or Dr. Brown noted that systems to inform parents about the content and the suitability of games already exist. And she highlighted the need to raise awareness and understanding of those systems. Now, the UK government's response, I'm pretty sure this was the tail end of the Brown government, perhaps, focused primarily on internet safety rather than games. But the recommendation that was made in the report was that the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, should play a bigger role in games classification. But that was then superseded by the Digital Economy Act in 2010, which passed responsibility for video games ratings to the Video Standards Council, using the now very familiar PEGI system that covers all of Europe. So this is a problem that persists. Either people don't know that games can contain this stuff, or they don't know that games are suitably rated to prevent people who shouldn't be viewing this stuff from viewing it. But there's also, I think, probably some unhelpful press coverage. And this comes off the back of, it's not necessarily, we're not blaming the journalists here, right? I think probably the most controversial condemnation of video games has come from the WHO, from the World Health Organization, who added something called gaming disorder to their list of diseases and ailments. So according to the WHO, gaming disorder is the kind of gaming behavior that results in marked distress or significant impairment in family, personal, social, educational, or other important areas of our life. and they file gaming disorder under disorders due to addictive behaviors. However, lots of academics and researchers don't think that gaming disorder should be in there at all. There was a very well publicized letter that came out just after that in 2018, 2019, or whenever it was, that a lot of us, including myself and a lot of more prestigious and influential academics, particularly from psychology, signed it and said, look, this is nonsense, right? This is just perpetuating myths. And so we see this come up time and again. This was these kind of stories come up in the press. My gaming addiction stops me from having relationships, as you can see in this particular headline. Much more recently, I think this was earlier this year or perhaps last year, this tweet from BBC 5 Live. Now, the reason I've included this one is partly to illustrate that this is an ongoing issue, but also because I was on this show and I got a call from the producer saying, the BBC here, for balance, we need someone to come on and talk about, games in a more positive light. I've done a little bit of this before and it was fine. I said, yeah, that's fine, no problem. And usually, as many of you will know, you'll get a little bit of prep when you do these things. Your producer will talk you through what's going to happen. And there was none of that here. I just found myself on the radio with Nikki Campbell, and everybody else on the call had some personal story, a bit like the chap on the left here, about how games had ruined their lives. That wasn't a great experience, I have to say, because I didn't particularly feel like I could, who am I to say that their lived experience was in any way invalid? So the best I could do was gently suggest that this wasn't, universally the case. There was a guy on there whose marriage had dissolved because of him playing games where he'd racked up debt or something on the back of games. And I wasn't going to say on national radio that I don't believe you or this isn't true. Of course it's true. There are, of course, going to be instances where games, or like any other pastime, can take over too large a role in our lives. But it was very difficult for me to say on radio, games are good whenever you're against those kind of very personal, very real stories. Anyway, coming back to the research, I mentioned that there's a problem with the research that seems to show that games are bad for you. A lot of it is quite badly done, or it's built on shaky foundations. Some of you may be familiar with the image on the left. That's a Bobo doll experiment from the late 60s, probably, which claimed to show that kids observing aggressive behavior would simply copy it. But an experiment like that can only show short-term effects, right? When you're given a doll like that, which rocks back and forth, and that's all it does when you hit it, what else are you going to do? I would hit the thing, right? That's what it's there for. So that's the kind of shaky foundations that we're built on, that this research is built on, because it is very hard to ethically measure the effect of games or any other stimulus on kids, right? You can't get the kids to play a game and then give them a knife and see what happens, right? That's just, we can't do that. So that's one issue with the research, is that it is very hard to do meaningful, long-term longitudinal studies that are ethical and robust. But also there are problems across a lot of the gaming disorder research. One of them is poor basic reporting standards, right? That's salami slicing on the right, by which I mean multiple publications being generated from a single data set, right, without proper cross attribution. That's what we call salami slicing, where you're taking the same sausage and just slicing it up into lots and lots of pieces. So lots of the most commonly cited papers that claim to show a link between, say, games and violent behavior actually rely on the same data set that's used repeatedly to show the same result in multiple papers. And that's well documented. Shubisky at Oxford, for example, has done a good paper on that. And that inflates the number, or apparent number, of independent studies and complicates like systematic reviews of the literature. And then what's interesting is, if you really dive into it, some of those studies actually interpret the same data differently. There's also very low data transparency. Only a handful of these studies actually share their data. So there's a lack of transferability. It's very hard to reproduce those data. And also some fairly dodgy research practices. Um, there are a lot of cross-sectional studies with healthy populations rather than longitudinal studies that would show affected populations or the effect on populations. As we all know, an observational study is just a snapshot in time. You can't show causation, only correlation. You can show that there's maybe a correlation, let's say, between video games and depression, but that might just be showing underlying issues, right? Maybe someone's using a game as a coping mechanism because of some underlying problem. So yeah, when you start to confuse correlation with causation, that's, I would expect better of my undergrads, frankly, right? There's also publication bias. If you get a really strong apparent negative effect, people are going to love to publish that stuff, and it tends to generate press coverage as well. But it's not all bad news. So let's get on to the good stuff. So there's also evidence to suggest a positive relationship. And here I'm talking about a correlation, just a relationship between video games and well-being. I'm not making any claims here about causation, but there is just as much as there's research showing a correlation between games and bad stuff, there's also a growing body of work that shows a correlation between games and good stuff. And actually, some of the good stuff has actually been shown in experimental studies too. So we already know from the earlier slides that lots of people play video games. But it was really striking to me, I think to lots of people, the extent to which games became quite central to how people coped during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Ofcom reported something like more than half of the UK population were playing games to cope with lockdown. And we did a little study, or a large-ish study, I would say, at the University of Glasgow that was intended to sort of explore some of these effects through a survey of about 800 players. And it was to try and put a little bit more to improve our understanding of what we could see more anecdotally or in our personal lives, documenting how video games were being used during the pandemic, with a particular interest in how games were affecting players' well-being, for better or for worse. And our findings largely mirrored what's Ofcom had found. 71% of our respondents reported that they were playing games more, and nearly 60% of our respondents reported that games had impacted their well-being, with the overwhelming majority of responses indicating a positive impact. So using thematic analysis, we went through all of the data we collected and identified 7 broad areas in which playing video games was reported to have affected players. The first of these was a very broad category of mental health. In retrospect, I think this could be broken down a little bit further. But here's an example of someone who was very anxious during that time. Understandably, they were separated from their family, and games helped improve their mental health in terms of reducing anxiety. And improving mood and alleviating conditions like anxiety were pretty common in our research. And there were lots of references to people coping with lockdown, which is kind of what Ofcom found as well. And there have been previous studies, I think it was Rieger 2014, I think, that have shown how games can potentially have a restorative effect on mood, right? So this wasn't news, but in this context, it was interesting to observe. Then this is obviously very closely related to mental health, but it was so common that we pulled it out into a theme of its own, becoming less stressed by playing games. Lots of players reported using games to relax or de-stress, often citing just the simple enjoyment that came from playing games, especially when other forms of entertainment during lockdown were unavailable. And again, there's prior evidence to suggest that games can help players de-stress. Going back to early 2000s, there are papers that show that games can help you recuperate from stress and strain. But also there are studies like my own, another one, which I'll talk about shortly, which was an unexpected side effect, right? Players reporting stress relief as a side effect of playing games when we weren't even looking for it. Another aspect that we found in our data was that games provide escape from the world. I mean, the girl had kind of gone to hell a little bit during that period, and this relates to games reported capacity for us to be able to escape. And lots of respondents, which I thought was very interesting, compared video games favorably to social media, right? Describing games as a healthier distraction from COVID than doom scrolling, as one of the respondents put it through their feed. And of course, escape has long been understood as one of the motivations for playing games in the first place. So in some ways, again, it's kind of no surprise that people were reporting that here, especially when there was lots to escape from. Interestingly, one of the first place I submitted this paper to for peer review was rejected on the basis that escape was a bad thing. It was entirely valid. There we go. Cognitive stimulation, right? Keeping your mind busy. So in addition to just staving off boredom, respondents also made reference to exercising the brain and being able to explore new experiences and getting some mental stimulation. And again, there's lots of evidence in the literature to suggest that games can, improve or at least exercise cognitive skills. So again, that one probably wasn't a huge surprise. Then there's this feeling of control or this feeling of agency. And lots of players talked about how video games provided them with a sense of control or fulfillment that was otherwise lacking during lockdown. We didn't have a lot of control over what we could do with our lives at that time. And again, agency is one of those very well documented motivations for playing games. And agency, as I'm sure many people will know, is along with competence and autonomy, linked to our basic psychological needs according to self-determination theory. So, and games can actually hit all three of those, right? It gives us a sense of agency, a sense of competence, and a sense of autonomy. And for all three of those to some degree, but especially agency, those things were lacking during the lockdown. We didn't really feel like we were in control. The social aspects of playing video games, I think, are often overlooked by people who don't play them. So again, forgive me, I'm preaching to the choir here. But players made lots of references to the opportunities for social interaction that games gave them during lockdown. And there's lots of prior research here that shows that games can combat loneliness and promote pro-social behavior, and so on and so forth. Rachel Cowart's work in this area is particularly strong. And then finally, normalization. Players reported how video games provided them with a link back to their normal pre-COVID lives, providing structure to the day, apart from anything else. If what you did when you went home, when you knocked off at work during more normal times was go home and play video games, then that's something you could still do. Now, what I thought was interesting to note was that the US Center for Disease Control in their guidance suggests that people should try and do enjoyable things that are part of their normal life as much as possible during a crisis. So I would, perhaps playfully, but maybe not so playfully, suggest that maybe video games have a role to play in how we cope with disasters. Yes, so the study did also highlight a couple of negative responses. I have to say, overwhelmingly, it was positive. Like people were talking about how video games had helped improve their well-being. But for balance, we have to note that there were several cases where negative comments about the impact of playing video games were mentioned, but almost always they were balanced out with these more positive sentiments. The main concern that I think our players voiced was that they were spending too much time doing something that wasn't worthwhile or wasn't productive, right? It's probably all Protestants. Sorry. But that sort of sense that we need to be that work ethic, that sense that we need to be producing. It was sort of guilt that we were playing video games. Thing is, there was not for depending on your job. If you were furloughed, say from a construction job or something, what else were you going to do, right? You couldn't really be productive in the sense that you normally were. So this idea that the positive outweighs the negative was writ large there as well. So that was our work on games and well-being. I think that since most people are playing video games, I think it's notable that we haven't had an epidemic or a pandemic of video game addiction and video game based violence because most people are playing games. I'm not saying that games don't carry some risk for some people. There are, of course, people who will develop an unhealthy relationship with games, but and that can look like addiction. But there are games, and there are games that are clearly labeled as being not suitable for younger players. But all of those risks have to be weighed against this increasing body of evidence that games might actually be a force for good, I think, with some social benefits, emotional benefits, maybe cognitive benefits. And so I think we need to be a little bit more open-minded about this. I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but the next study I'll look at is about games and learning. And that, actually, I'll wait until I get to that bit. Let's go on. So this is a quick diversion into a slightly earlier study that we did, but again, it's a kind of good news story about games. And it's kind of veering into maybe educational psychology. Certainly, it's about learning. So many of the people on the call will have been through or still be part of higher education, and you'll know that we are expected to produce graduates that are adequately prepared for the workplace. And that means coming with certain skills and competencies that universities sometimes call rather self-aggrandizing as graduate attributes, as if you can't get these attributes elsewhere. But it's things like communication skill, being able to think critically, being able to adapt. The truth is that embedding the development of those skills into the curriculum isn't always straightforward. If you have large class sizes, you can't get everybody up and doing, work that involves communication or adapting. You get a lot of didactic teaching with people standing up in front of the room and just talking at you. So the work that I'm about to go into talks a little bit about how games can exercise some of those skills that employers are looking for and maybe develop these attributes. And I'm going to apologize now, as I always do when I give this kind of a talk, about the parade of uh, gray white men, and which now includes me, which is unfortunate, but there we are. Anyway, here's our first graying white man. This is John Seeley Brown. Many of you may know of him. He is an academic, yes, but he's also a normal person too. He's a business person. And he has worked at Deloitte, Amazon, Xerox, those kinds of places. And he is somewhat famously, and I think probably with a little bit of a glint in his eye, suggested he'd rather hire someone who's really good at World of Warcraft than someone with an MBA from Harvard. And what he's talking about here is that video games require players to exercise the skills like communication, collaboration, strategic thinking, the things that he's looking for when he's hiring someone from the business world. Which is not always something that we can produce in our graduates. That's what he's saying anyway. And here's our other old white guy, who's lovely, I have to say. But another smarter person than me who had this idea before I ever did. This is James Paul G, who is or was, I think he may have retired now, a professor of literary studies at Arizona State University, who says that learning is a deep human need, like mating and eating, and it's meant to be pleasurable to human beings. And the joke I always make, but I'll make it again, is that I don't think my students come away from my lectures saying they were deeply pleasurable. And we can't lose sight of the fact that learning is supposed to be fun, right? Because we don't always have a great experience of our formal education. Anyway, what G's pointing out is that games exercise players' critical thinking and reflective learning, which again are the kind of attributes we want in employees. But he's talking about games that are made for entertainment purposes. And underpinning this whole idea is this idea that we're wired to enjoy learning, and games tap into that. I'll probably skip over the slide quite quickly, just given the audience, but you people know that this isn't by accident, right? Games have, or game designers, I suppose, have honed the art of teaching players how to play their games. And we write books about it, right? We train aspiring game designers how to do this. So not only does part of the fun playing games come from learning how to master them, games are also designed to teach us at least how to play them. And if you look at a good game design textbook, it'll actually contain a lot of the same ideas about learning that you'd find in an educational context. Of course, the names are going to be different. There aren't very many game design books that talk about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? But it's the same thing. this idea that about how we scaffold learning and how the real learning happens in that sweet zone between being bored and being overly challenged. So we see a lot of this stuff in the game design literature that is basically cribs, whether deliberately or not, from the educational psychology literature as well. So I'll skip over that one. If we were in the room together, I'd ask some people to name this. This is Civilization 3, in fact. I'm a 6 around the corner. This is going to start to look pretty old, but it's here for a reason, because this is a little bit of work that inspired the work we did at Glasgow. So there was a guy called Kurt Squire, Dr. Kurt Squire, who was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he did his doctorate on teaching it's called social history, a form of history to college students using Civilization 3. And in his book, he talks about his experience of doing so. And he didn't have the top flight students. He had students in his class who had failed it before. And I get the impression that the principal basically said, yeah, I don't care what you do, off you go. Use a video game if you want. And he introduced Civilization to the class. And after some initial resistance, which I think is maybe surprises some, but some initial resistance from the students, he had some fairly considerable success with the students playing the game together under his supervision. And what really caught my eye about this work was that the students began to develop conceptual understanding across history, geography, politics. They started to understand world history not as a series of dates to memorize, but as a system of interrelating factors. And they started to develop their problem-solving skills along the way. And a large portion of the students, according to Kurt, were able to discuss their strategies, strengths and weaknesses of various civilizations, and also the limitations of civilization, the game, as a system, including the possibility of bias. They clocked that this is an American product. What biases, what understanding of the world from an American point of view is it bringing to the game design? So that was quite sophisticated. I thought they were developing their critical thinking skills, their decision-making, problem solving, but also adapting and being resourceful, because anyone who's played a strategy game knows that you can't really tell what's going to happen, right? And you have to react and make the best of the resources that you've got. So it was based on this work that we went and did our work at Glasgow, to see how games could potentially develop these employability type skills, including communication. I'll just keep moving on. Adaptability, which is perhaps even more tenuous, and then I couldn't find any amusing clip art, and let's just go for MacGyver. Who else embodies resourcefulness better? So we focus on these 3 skills because they're actually amongst the attributes that our university claims to develop, in common with many universities in our students. And also, I was able to find some previously validated measures for measuring them, validated means of measuring them. So how do we do it? Well, we did a sort of, we did our best to sort of, I'd probably call it quasi-experimental, but we recruited 100 undergraduate students and randomly assigned them to 2 groups. An intervention group that was going to play selected video games over a semester, over about 8 weeks, and another group that would not play the games. They would just go about their business. So that was our control group. So both groups were tested at the beginning and the end of the semester using these previously validated measures of communication, adaptability, and resourcefulness. And then we calculated differences in attainment between the 2 groups across the semester. So we set up this lab where the students could drop in, play the games. It was on their schedule, right? So it was up to them to manage their time. They treated it like any other resource on campus, be that the gym, the library, the bar. They could choose to play just 5 minutes more if they wanted to. So it's kind of like you'd expect if you were to run a gaming lab on campus. We tried to say, well, what would that look like? We thought it would look something like this. These are the games we looked at, the games that we used. Sure, pretty much everyone on the call will recognize this as being Minecraft. These were games that we selected on the basis, well, from input from a panel of experts. We said, these are the attributes or the skills that we want to develop. What games do you think? Minecraft, we ran this off a local server, so it was like local multiplayer. We had a little server in the lab. And what was really nice to see was a lot of interesting pro-social behavior. You had people, because it randomized the participants, you had people who had played lots of games before, all the way through to people who had never played a game in their life. Um, and the more experienced players started to teach people how to play things like Minecraft, which was nice to see. But there was also quite spontaneous collaboration and cooperation that was going on, which is more of these attributes that we were looking to develop. They built a little house together, and this was actually asynchronously. You know, they would come in between classes, and then they'd go away again, and then some other people would come in between their classes, and they would share resources. They put them in a little chest in the house, and they helped each other. This is Portal 2, which, if you haven't played it, I find increasingly difficult, or I always find difficult to explain. It's billed as a kind of physics-based puzzler, but its a point is it has a two-player cooperative mode that requires not just all the critical thinking and problem solving, but also communication and collaboration in order to advance. This is a Lara Croft game, a spin-off from the Tomb Raider franchise, which is again cooperative. You have to work together. You can see there's two characters on the screen, and they have to work together to solve puzzles and advance. This is Borderlands 2, which is, yes, it's a shooter, but it's cooperative, right? And again, it was played on a local area network, local multiplayer. And it was quite handy because players could drop in and out. So in between classes, someone might leave the group, then someone else might drop in and take their place. This was an older one, which was put in partly because I wanted to, because I liked it, but also I wanted a strategy game in there. But this was played in multiplayer mode. So it was the students would band together and go up against the computer, essentially. They would play as allies. So they would have to cooperate and communicate in order to defeat the computer. Team Fortress 2 hit a lot of the same, ticked a lot of the same boxes as Borderlands 2, but it has very strongly defined roles in the game. So different character classes. So you've got the big tank guy who's, you know, can take a few hits and deal a lot of damage, but doesn't move quickly. And then you've got the people who can move quickly or heal others. So that meant that the students had to take on these different roles in order to succeed. Then finally, there were a couple of non-multiplayer games. This is a game called Papers, Please, which is described not very helpfully as a dystopian document thriller. The point is that you play like an immigration officer on the border of a fictional East European state, and you have to check people's papers as they cross the border. And it raises lots of interesting ethical questions, which is another thing that our students are supposed to be considering. But it really exercises your critical thinking and your ability to adapt because the rules keep changing, getting more and more complicated, and then there's conflicting evidence and you know, some very harrowing personal stories that you have to weigh up against the actual evidence in the papers. And then finally, Gone Home, which is a kind of interactive story adventure. You kind of explore an apparently abandoned house, and you piece together the story by looking at all the clues that are dotted around there. So those last two games, particularly Gone Home, they weren't multiplayer, but the students in the room, in the lab together would actually, you know, compare notes. You know, have you seen this thing? What do you think this means? And so on. So I said that we measured these attributes, these skills, at the beginning and the end, and we had the intervention group that played the games and the control group that did, and that allows us to do a little bit of science. So we were measuring score change on those three measures over a semester. Yeah, so if we have a look at this, you can see that the mean change in the control group was either around 0 or maybe slightly negative. But for the game playing intervention group, the average changes were actually positive. In fact, the average score change was significantly more positive in the game playing intervention group than in the control group across all three skill measures. And those score changes look pretty big when we try to normalize them for standard deviation. The effect size, if you like, is large, right? It's around 1. So we've got large effect sizes. P-values are less valuable or considered less valuable these days, but the p-value being the probability of getting these differences between the groups as large as we did simply by chance when there was no difference. The p-value suggests that that was not the case. They were very low. Perhaps a more interesting or reliable measure is this 95% confidence interval. It's the final column. So what that's saying there is that we would expect the difference between the groups to fall between these values if we were to repeat the experiment in 95% of cases. So what's important to note there is that none of those confidence intervals cross 0, all positive. So we would expect, according to the stats, for there to be a positive difference in the game playing group in 95% of cases. If you don't like all that, we can just count the stuff. And we can see that the percentage of participants in this case looking at communication scores with the percentage who improved their scores was greater in the game playing group compared to the non-game playing group. And so we can sort of say in summary, badly formatted slide, that there were real and apparently significant differences between the two groups. It looked like the game playing intervention actually worked. Of course, there are limitations to all of this. There's limitations to every experiment or every study you can do. I probably won't spend too much time on it tonight because I've been talking a long time already, but we also did interviews. I'll pick out a couple of examples. We did interviews with the students who were involved in this to see how they thought they were developing these skills. But certainly the stats were what caught people's attention, and seeing those differences between the two groups helped convince a few people. Yeah, there's a link there to the paper, and I'll share the slides with Margaret afterwards so you can have a look at this in due course. But I did talk to the students afterwards, and in summary, the students who played the games were fairly positive about using video games to develop their skills. And, you know, as Kurt Squire encountered with his Civilization, there was some initial skepticism. There was a sense that video games could offer an authentically fun means of developing these skills. By that, I mean, these are games that students recognize as being commercial games that were designed to be fun. They weren't what we call in the trade chocolate covered broccoli, right? Where you're trying to trick a kid into eating their broccoli by dipping it in chocolate. Those kind of educational games that are kind of not fun. These games were authentically fun, is what I'm getting at there. They were designed to be fun. It just so happened that they exercise communication skills. So yes, I'll let you read these in your own time. There's no point in me reading out the words of these particular students. This person was a little bit more cautious. It's worth maybe highlighting this one. They were a little bit dismissive of the perceived quality of his communication, but he got the job done. So the communication was effective. There's no time to pontificate when you're in a high pressure situation. So the quality, it wasn't like wasn't nicely written prose or nicely enunciated prose. It was short and snappy and to the point. So on and so forth. So, I mean, this is kind of no surprise to people on the call. In order to succeed at playing a multiplayer video game, you have to communicate. You have to communicate quickly in a time-sensitive, high-pressure environment. A little bit like real life, but unlike real life, the stakes are dramatically lowered, right? No one's going to die as a result of your inability to communicate effectively. And also what I thought was interesting to watch was that the students had to communicate across differing levels of ability and experience. That was quite interesting, particularly for the players who were much more experienced at these games. You know, they had all the shorthand, they had the way of communicating quickly with their peers. That all evaporated when they were playing with someone who barely put their hands on the keyboard to do the WASD controls before in their life. They had to adapt how they communicated. Again, I'll not read all of this out. This is more qualitative work. So I went on and wrote a book about this that pulled it all together. But I added to the book this chapter where I talked to the game developers. The short answer here is, in terms of what the game developers told me, was it by design that these games could develop certain skills? The answer was yes, but in order just to make the games better, right? It wasn't, I mean, the game developers, when prompted, could all see the potential for their games to develop these skills, but that wasn't why they did it. They did it to make the games better, to make them more interesting. So I talked to Paul Hellquist, who was the lead on Borderlands 2, which is one of the games in the study, and he talked about how he was interested in developing or requiring critical thinking in the game, not in order to develop that skill, but to make the game more interesting to play. So rather than, for example, when you pick up a weapon or an item, having a single number that tells you how good it is, you'd have a suite of numbers, a suite of stats that you'd have to think about. And think about, well, does this help me with my particular play style? You have to weigh things up. You have to exercise your critical thinking. And for him, that made Borderlands a better game. And it just so happened to exercise critical thinking. This was a terrifying man, Mike Ambinder, who knew that Valve, who are behind Steam platform and plenty of some of the best games of all time, they have a principal experimental psychologist on staff, which implies the existence of further experimental psychologists. Um, as a scientist, he would not make any claims whatsoever about their games, but he was able to point to the mechanics in the games that Valve have put there to make the games more interesting, right? So this Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2 is a cooperative game. And you get a better score, you get a bigger bonus if everyone finishes the game together. So that inherently encourages communicate or collaboration. Others were not necessarily talking about the kind of skills and competencies that like communication and resourcefulness, more about the kind of the softer end of the scale. I've mentioned already some of the kind of ethical and social awareness that games can potentially develop. And that's what Matt Charles was telling me about, being exposed to something allows you to develop empathy, to walk in somebody else's shoes. And he went on to talk about how a game that Gearbox had published some years before, Brothers in Arms, which is, yes, it's a war game, but it's based on um, some historical documentation and reports from the time for authenticity. And for him, that's the kind of game that really makes you think about, the way he put it, was the kind of sacrifice um, during war. Anyway, so this little learning study generated some positive press, which is really nice. I do think it was because I had stats in there. People like numbers, whereas I'm more of a qualitative guy. But people picked up on the sort of randomized flavor of the work. Now, it's worth pointing out that not all of the media outlets reported these findings accurately. It was a good news story, yes, but I was worried about having to explain to my vice principal why one of the tabloids, I think it was maybe the Scottish Daily Express, was saying that playing video games, not studying, was what you needed in order to get into university. I'd also recommend against reading below the line, reading the comments in online articles. It was pretty horrendous. So there's a lot of work still to be done. People don't necessarily see games as being positive. On that note, here's a quote from some years ago now from one of let's call them one of the UK's leading politicians, and they wrote, "They become like blinking lizards, motionless, absorbed, only the twitching of their hands showing they are still conscious. These machinations teach them, or these machines teach them nothing. They stimulate no ratiocination, discovery, or feat of memory, although some of them may cunningly pretend to be educational." Some of you may know who wrote that. Be careful politically. But for me personally, I quite like the other end of that guy's argument. Anyway, moving on. Here are links to the research. The papers are both open access. I can just send you a free PDF of the book if you like. But that is me and how to reach me. Putting my new Blue Sky, well, not new Blue Sky handle, but everyone seems to be moving to Blue Sky, so all right, pop that on there too. Thank you. That's me.